Versailles, a symbol of France's splendor and grandeur. Mirrored halls, endless galleries, golden gates, where even the sun seemed to bow down to its master, Louis XIV. The king, nicknamed the Sun King, wanted everything in his palace to shine and impress. But behind the gilding lay a truth that no TV series about kings would ever show. In the morning, when the ministers gathered in the royal chambers, they waited for the high moment, the king's public toilet. Yes, there was a whole ritual at Versailles. Louis sat on a special chair with a pot, and the courtiers stood around him. It was considered a great honor to be present when the monarch did, well, his business. Someone brought documents, someone made suggestions, and all this was accompanied by sounds that, you must admit, were not very reminiscent of a majestic symphony. The paradox is that the palace itself had over 700 rooms, but almost no normal toilets. Contemporaries wrote that even aristocrats sometimes went to relieve themselves in fireplaces or behind curtains. And to emphasize his uniqueness, Louis even created a special position, Master of Night Pots. It was an honorable service. People literally competed for the right to carry the royal waste, because it meant access to his chambers and to the monarch's ear. At large receptions at Versailles, portable potties were sometimes placed directly in the halls for guests. Imagine gold, crystal, candles, and someone in the corner taking care of urgent business. For modern people, this sounds absurd, but back then it was all part of etiquette. Rumor had it that even expensive tapestries couldn't mask the smell. Some contemporaries joked that Versailles resembled a gilded sewer rather than a true center of civilization. But the courtiers did not complain. For them, it was part of the game. Being closer to the king, even in such delicate moments, meant being closer to power. Even those closest to the king, such as his wife and favorite Madame de Maintenon, were forced to live in the same stuffy rooms. She, who went down in history as Louis's spiritual advisor, spent her days in luxury, constantly accompanied by the stench of Versailles. Behind the outward splendor of Versailles lay a striking truth, a palace where the sun shone in the mirrors, but the air was filled with stench. And this stench was an integral part of Louis XIV's grandeur. When we imagine ladies and gentlemen of the 17th to 18th centuries, images from films come to mind: sparkling dresses, lace, fans, wigs decorated with pearls. But behind this exquisite picture lay a truth that today sounds like a scene from a horror movie. Let's start with women's dresses. They were so heavy and complicated that it was almost impossible to take them off without the help of maids. Often, women would wear the same outfit for weeks, as washing expensive fabrics was considered risky, and washing it was out of the question. First, there was no technology that would allow expensive fabrics to be cleaned safely. Second, it was believed that water could ruin the fabric. Therefore, all these silks and velvets retained not only the scent of perfume, but also some less pleasant aromas. Now imagine this scene. Hundreds of young ladies in a ballroom, their dresses heavy with dirt mixed with sweat and food residue that accidentally got on the fabric. To mask this bouquet of scents, they doused themselves liberally with perfume. And here's an interesting fact. Most aristocratic fragrances were not made from flowers, but from things that we would find repulsive today. Ambergris was extracted from the intestines of sperm whales, musk from the glands of musk deer, and castoreum from the secretions of beavers. So the true scent of luxury literally consisted of animal-derived scents. Men were not far behind. Huge wigs, which seemed to be a status symbol, were often teeming with lice. To avoid going mad from itching, courtiers even had a fashion for carrying small metal combs, known as scratchers, so that they could discreetly scratch their heads under their wigs right at the balls. The most desperate resorted to using a mixture of vinegar or even mercury to remove the parasites, risking their own health in the process. King Charles II of England, known for his passion for perfumes, generously doused himself with fragrances to mask the stench of London. And his contemporary, Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough, was famous for her wigs, which were so lush that they required separate maids to care for them. A person who could go weeks without washing but generously doused themselves in fragrances was still perceived in high society not as dirty, but as fashionable. True hygiene gave way to pseudo-hygiene. The smell of sweat and filth was simply covered up with a thick layer of roses, jasmine, or musk. So, English fashion was like theater. The audience saw glamour and sophistication, but behind the scenes there was sweat, lice, and an aromatic war with one's own body. And the winner in this war was not soap, but perfume. In our imagination, Paris is a city of love, the aroma of coffee and croissants, narrow streets, and romance. But if we go back 300 years, the aroma of this city was completely different. 17th century Paris was more like a giant open-air toilet. The narrow streets of the capital at that time had no sewage system. Everything that today is neatly flushed away at the touch of a button was then simply thrown out of the windows of houses. People collected waste in jugs or buckets, and then simply poured it outside. This was usually accompanied by a loud cry of "Gardez l'eau," or "Garde l'eau," for short, which meant beware of the water. And if you were lucky, you had time to jump aside. If not, your new suit immediately became street decor. There were also more extravagant solutions. In some areas of Paris, chamber pots were built into the walls of houses. People could simply use them on the street, and it was even considered convenient. It is easy to imagine the smell in such conditions, a mixture of human waste, rotten food, dead animals, and mud. Some foreign travelers left descriptions in which they wrote directly that Paris stank worse than any village or camp. To make life a little easier, the authorities ordered fragrant herbs, mint, rosemary, or juniper, to be scattered on the streets. But these smells disappeared within a few minutes. Even during the time of Jean-Baptiste Colbert, Louis XIV chief finance minister, who reformed the state and tried to make Paris a modern city, the waste problem remained unresolved. The loud "Garde l'eau" was a constant sound in the capital. Add horses to that. Paris did not have cars, but it did have thousands of carts and carriages moving around the city. As a result, the streets were littered with horse manure. In summer, it turned into stinking dust, and in winter, into mud in which people slipped and fell. Some streets even got nicknames, Rotten Alley, Stinking Gate, because it was simply impossible to breathe there. The most ironic thing is that palaces, theaters, and cathedrals were built alongside this stench. People absorbed the beauty of the architecture, but at the same time were forced to walk through streets where, according to eyewitness accounts, puddles of waste could reach their ankles. Paris at that time was the showcase of Europe, the capital of fashion and culture. But in reality, it was more like a public toilet. And this was a reality that was hidden behind lace and elaborate hairstyles. Today, it seems obvious to us. Cleanliness equals health. Daily showers, hand washing, hot baths after a hard day. But for the European nobility of the 17th and 18th centuries, water was not a symbol of cleanliness, but almost a threat to life. It was believed that water opened the pores of the body, allowing diseases to enter the body. They were especially afraid of the plague, which repeatedly swept across Europe in terrible waves. Therefore, washing in the bath or shower was perceived as a risky experiment. Louis XIV, the Sun King, could afford any luxury. But according to his doctors, he only took a bath a few times a year, and that was more out of necessity than desire. And when his doctors ordered him to avoid bathing altogether, the king obediently complied. Instead of water, they used linen. Changing one's shirt was considered almost the same as washing. There were also other strange methods of hygiene. For example, doctors advised wiping the body with wine or vinegar, which was considered safer than water. There were also so-called dry baths. A person was sprinkled with powder made from dried herbs or fragrant soap, as if sprinkling a cake with powdered sugar. Some went even further. They used gunpowder or ashes, believing that this cleansed the body and drove out disease. The courtiers picked up on this trend. Among the wealthy, hygiene increasingly came down not to water and soap, but to constantly changing underwear and clothes, wiping oneself with vinegar and rose scents. You don't wash, you renew the layers of fabric on your body. The irony is that a few thousand kilometers away, in Eastern Europe, in Russia and Poland, baths and saunas were commonplace. There, people bathed every week, doused themselves with cold water, and even believed that hot steam expelled disease. For Russians, the French Versailles would seem not like the center of civilization, but simply a smelly fair in a golden frame. But in Europe, the fear of water was so strong that even doctors wrote, "It is better not to risk it." And so a person with a wig worth 100 louis d'or could eBay for years without knowing what a proper wash was. In the 18th century, this fashion persisted even among the most famous figures. Marie Antoinette, Queen of France, avoided bathing and preferred fragrant powders and perfumes. For her, luxury was associated not with bodily cleanliness, but with layers of expensive clothing and fragrances. Gold, lace, and perfume hid a simple truth. European kings feared water more than political conspiracies. Imagine a ball at Versailles or a London palace. Music, crystal, candles, the rustle of dresses on the parquet floor. Hundreds of guests in wigs, silk, and sparkling diamonds. It seems like the perfect setting for a romantic story. But if you were transported there for a moment, the first thing you would notice would not be the music, but the smell. In crowded halls, the stench became a real character of the evening. Perfumes were ineffective, and the guests' natural needs did not help the situation either. Remember, there were virtually no toilets in palaces. So often, waste was simply left in the corners of the hall or under the stairs. Servants would then clean it up, but the smell remained forever. Now think about wigs. Huge, intricate constructions that sometimes reached half a meter in height. Ladies could show off hairstyles with small cages, where, according to rumors, canaries or parrots sang. Contemporaries even retold stories that candy or small accessories were sometimes hidden in wigs to treat acquaintances, a kind of surprise bar on the head. There were also legends about the dark side of fashion. Allegedly, mice would nest in complex hairstyles. For this purpose, special traps were placed near the bed to scare away rodents. It is difficult to say whether this was actually common, but it was these tales that made court hairstyles a symbol not only of luxury, but also of the curiosities of the time. Contemporaries even joked that at balls, people sometimes fainted from the heavy cocktail of smells, a mixture of sweat, filth, and excessive amounts of perfume. It is difficult to say how widespread this phenomenon was, but such references can be found in memoirs of the time. And, of course, no one admitted that the reason was the stench. Everyone willingly blamed it on excessive emotions from dancing. Contemporaries recalled that hairstyles like those worn by Italian Princess Maria Luisa of Savoy reached almost half a meter in height, and Madame de Pompadour, the famous mistress of Louis XV, ordered such complex wigs that special stands were made for her to sleep on so that her head would not fall over. For courtiers, the main thing was not convenience or comfort, but status. The higher the wig, the higher the social status. The more expensive the perfume, the more you could drown out your own body. And no one dared to admit that behind this glamour lay a complete illusion. So, royal balls sparkled with candles and jewels, but their real backdrop was the stifling aroma of sweat, perfume, and garbage. And this contrast, gold and dirt side by side, best describes the civilization of European courts. European royal courts of the 17th and 18th centuries are always presented to us as the pinnacle of beauty and luxury. Versailles, Buckingham Palace, Vienna. These are symbols of splendor that are impressive even today. But the real picture was much more contrasting. On the one hand, there was gold, mirrors, crystal chandeliers, and dresses decorated with hundreds of pearls. On the other, there was stench, lice, filth, and fear of water. Louis XIV could sit on the potty while his ministers discussed the fate of the state. English ladies could wear dresses for weeks that were rarely washed, as it was believed that washing would ruin expensive fabrics. Paris, the capital of culture and fashion, was also a city where a bucket of waste could fall on your head. And all this was considered normal. And this problem was not limited to palaces. 18th century London faced an ecological disaster. Every year, horses left more than 100,000 tons of manure on the streets. Newspapers wrote that if this continued, the city would literally drown in waste. The situation in Paris was no better. Sewage seeped into the ground, and travelers of the time wrote that the water in the wells often had a suspicious taste and could be dangerous. Complaints about poison water were constant, and people drank it without understanding why they were getting sick. This did not go unnoticed even by the intellectuals of the time. The philosopher Voltaire sarcastically called Paris a city of stench and philosophy, and Benjamin Franklin, after visiting France, was surprised that aristocrats avoided bathing but spent entire fortunes on perfume. Now let's look at the contrast. At the same time, Japan already had a whole system of centralized waste collection. Waste was not thrown away but sold to farmers as fertilizer. In other words, while Europe was drowning in stench and afraid of water, other cultures were finding practical and even profitable solutions. Why was this? Because the main thing was not the body, but the outer shell. Not cleanliness, but status. Water was frightening, smells were ignored, but glamour always remained. Kings may have been afraid of washing, but never of losing their appearance. Therefore, we can only imagine that glittering Europe shone with gold but stank like a garbage dump. And perhaps it is this contrast that best shows the price at which the illusion of grandeur was created.